we interrupt your regularly scheduled brainwashing in order to bring you breaking news. A special segment of the almost daily ZenCast, focused on curious, quirky, and quixotic news items that you may have missed during the last 48-hour news cycle. Hosted by me, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo.
Hello and namaste and welcome back, friends. Thank you for tuning in. I am your host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And this is News Breaking News, a special segment of the Almost Daily ZenCast. And that introduction is completely meant to be understood as comedy, satire, parody, and not to be taken too seriously. I think it was Confucius who said the human species needs a little bit of social conditioning in order to sustain a viable society. But society needs the human individual to liberate themselves from conditioning in order for society to sustain a viable human species. Or something to that effect. That was definitely the Mr. Zeppo version of whatever the actual Confucius quote was. So, friends, I entreat you, I welcome you, I encourage you to join me here for a second and taking a deep breath. And with that deep breath, letting go, setting aside, not forswearing, not betraying, not abandoning, but just setting down for a hot minute any and all ideological constructs from the political spectrum, any and all ideological constructs from organized religious, conditioning, any and all ideological constructs, period. We just set them down gently on a special spot. In the nook, in the lobby of the entryway to the common space we share when we sit down to do this thing we call podcasting, the theater of the imagination. And let's zoom, when we settle into our seats in the theater, let's imagine that we're going to all collectively join in our imagination in imagining a zoom out of the context, right? However you would represent that to yourself. You find yourself in this moment, history unfolding before us, events and discussion on public discourse and all the different levels that we have it about this document that was leaked and what it means, what it represents. And we are in this sort of zone of anticipation, this bubble of anticipation, waiting to see which shoe drops and when it drops. And by that I mean the final decision from SCOTUS. I'm so not used to using those terms, SCOTUS and POTUS. The first time, let me pause in a completely irrelevant and meaningless sidebar. It's got nothing to do with anything else besides the word POTUS and SCOTUS. I think it was I don't remember how many years ago. But I had somehow managed to never really catch on, never log and identify and integrate into my lexicon the acronym POTUS. I just hadn't encountered it enough times in my day-to-day, life, and was kind of tragically unaware of it. And then one day, not that long ago, it can't be more than 8 years ago. So this is in the last decade. Probably closer to the beginning of the last 10 years worth of being on Facebook or whatever platform I saw this on. But someone said something about, this is way back, however long ago, It may have been, I'm going to speculate, and if I'm wrong, I apologize. I'm not trying to misinform anyone, but I'm going to speculate that this incident, and I doubt that anyone, the person I had this conversation with in a comment thread, is an avid listener. I just wouldn't know if they were, and I doubt. It's statistically unlikely. And I'm not trying to troll them, I'm not trying to violate that whole EULA thing. It's a personal anecdote. I don't remember who I had the conversation with, so I'm not trying to invoke them or identify them in any way, shape, or form. But someone said something about President Obama in a comment thread that was clearly about Obama, because I think there was an image and there was his face, and I don't remember if it was pro or against, but there was definitely a pro-Obama, anti-Obama comment thread clash going on. Mild, gentle, nothing too egregious. And in response to something, and I don't know if they're responding to me or what, but someone referenced President Obama, but used the term POTUS. And I'd never seen it. If I had heard it, I'd never, like I said, whatever exposure I may have technically had to the term as an acronym in reference to the President of the United States. Which is funny that they don't use the A, but it also makes sense because they would just totally change the flow of the word and make it sound like some sort of curse word in Spanish. POTUS is perfect. I'm glad there isn't an A at the end. But my first time seeing it in all caps, being written by someone who I suspect, although I could be wrong, and I apologize if I am wrong, but I think they were trying to imply through their comment, they said something very brief, like POTUS, blah, blah, blah. It was a very brief sentence. I don't remember what the blah, blah, blah part was, but that definitely was intended to convey a connotation of like suspicion and doubt and lack of support, and sort of inferring that maybe some arguments elsewhere were correct. And I start back something about talking about the President of the United States with some respect, because in my total ignorance of the acronym, my brain just tried to register it and infer, contextualize and be like, what does that word potentially mean? And I thought it must be some sort of new slang derogatory, right? I thought it was some sort of diss term. I thought it was some sort of slangy internet, part of the lexicon of all of those over there trying to own the libtards. I didn't know. I digress. Of course, I was made a fool of, uninformed, quite, and I earned that one. I totally, I smiled. I laughed at myself. I indicated my own, lack of awareness on the issue and apologized. Civilized public discourse, folks, right? You gotta own up when you're wrong. But hold on. So anyway, backtracking. The President of the United States of America, the Supreme Court of the United States of America, these are institutions, right? And depending on your worldview, and depending on which political ideological spectrum, what end of the political ideological spectrum or what quadrant in the 4-zone, that graph, because that's a much more accurate depiction, even though we all run around just sort of debating everything in right versus left or left versus right terminology. These institutions, if we account for believable, realistic critique and set aside the outrageous claims that don't make sense, right? In terms of discussing these things, these institutions are meant to be checks and balances to each other, right? The three branches of government, Congress, what would it be COTUS, Congress of the United States of America, or it would be UTOC, the United States of America Congress? I don't know. But Congress, the judiciary, the executive. I don't pretend to be a civics major, right? Do they even have that major anymore? Do they even teach that? I'm an avid enthusiast of general broad stroke observations of the political landscape from the admittedly completely amateur perspective of like, I'm just a dude trapped here. I'm just a toaster oven stuck on the shelf of the political kitchen. That's my weird, awkward analogy. And put a pin on that, because I think I've explained it somewhere in the show before. Have fun tracking it down. You can't, because there's no search function on the audio. You just have to, like, enjoy the entire 5 years worth of podcast. And at this point, you should be glad that I don't actually release an episode every single day, because that would be way too much content, right? But I digress, friends. Zooming back, right, and taking as neutral, like Akram's razor, simplest worldview look at the nation, the states, the communities and jurisdictions they're in, and how they could be viewed as how they ought to operate according to the most admittedly aspirational model of like what America can, could, should, would, ought to be. Some people poo-poo aspirational thinking right off the bat without even considering what's being proposed, because I don't know what, because it's weakness, because it's not alpha male enough. I really don't get that whole argument. Because if we don't have aspirations, what are we guiding our actions by? Right? Some would respond morals and ethics. Yeah, but look at how morals and ethics are wildly disagreed upon and argued over. And this is the level to which I want to zoom out to, right? Let's take the most neutral view. Let's not buy into the most extreme accusation from any quadrant against other parties, and just sort of take it all as a sort of like, in theory, admittedly a theoretical, zoom out, high altitude view at what's going on. This is my concern. Sort of springboarding from what I ended the last episode with. And I'm not trying to cast aspersions. I'm not trying to defame anyone. I'm not trying to accuse anything. I'm speaking in terms of speculative questions and concerns and like observations of patterns over the last 30 years that add up to things, you know, a set of theories or theses, or is it thesi, plural? Like octopi, plural? I have several individual thesi. I kind of like thesi, but then it also sounds really foreign. Derailing my own train of thought. At the core of my thesis, let's call it all one. It's got many branches and many concerns and many caveats and many subparts. But at the core of my overall thesis, as I have long talked about and in my public discourse life, and when I say public discourse, I don't mean any one particular platform. I mean in any instance where I've engaged in conversation with an unfamiliar individual, someone that I don't know very well, someone that isn't a close friend, someone that isn't part of my family, someone in the outer rings that may very well have been a perfect stranger 10 minutes ago, in a library, on the bus, at the schools that I've attended, in the, at the pubs and bars and restaurants that I've hung out at and talked to other people. Not that I go around interrupting people and like forcing my opinions on those, but there are those times when conversations are struck up. Sometimes they stay surface and limited and they don't go very far. Sometimes, as they can and should do, that they dive into things. And of course, social media obviously gives us the opportunity to do that from just about anywhere in the world at any point in time, including on the sofa watching the news or, relieving our bowels in our innermost sanctums, and everything in between. Sorry, I didn't mean to get gross. So this is a thorny issue, and I don't mean to be, like, disrespectful or dismissive, right? I'm not trying to mansplain anything to any woman in either of these two episodes. But I am speaking to anyone willing to listen about my concerns that start, of course, at the core of the practical, pragmatic issue that women face that's being disrespected and disregarded by this movement, pushing so hard for so long to strip this constitutionally established right for reasons that may not make sense until, multiple pieces of other puzzles are put together. But zooming out, there's multiple layers there that spiral out from that very difficult, intimate, and painful center of the issue. But zooming out as far back as we can go and spiraling out through all those different layers, my genuine concern is that this thorny, challenging, difficult, triggering, traumatic issue, like many others, and it's a long list that I've, casually collected, that I've noticed this trend with. This issue, like many others, appears to have been weaponized against everyone. I don't want to say the term us because collectively very few people are comfortable with a universal us. But when I say us, I mean the entire human species. I don't mean this group or that agenda or this movement or this tribe or this collective or this particular, political, ideological, social, cultural, ideological, support group or whatever you call it, base. I mean the entire collective of humanity. This issue, abortion, and the many questions and concerns and problems and obstacles and complications that surround it are naturally difficult to navigate and it would seem to be potentially, quote unquote, naturally polarizing. But let's not fall into the rabbit hole of looking at this issue as we try to zoom out to the highest altitude from the perspective of the arguments and how they're constructed, right? Let's get the broadest possible view to see the trends and patterns. And my concern here is, without disrespecting the issue, without disrespecting the concerns, without disrespecting the very problem itself, because I'm not trying to do that in any way, shape, or form. I'm not trying to minimize or dismiss the problem as understood and perceived from the perspective of women living through it. I'm talking about the societal problem of the argument about the problem. That's the problem. Zooming out, the problem with the problem is that it has been weaponized against both sides of the argument. Let me edit that statement. The problem with the problem is that it has been weaponized against all sides, all possible sides, all imaginable sides of the argument. And this is not some strange, unique, crazy, weird thing that's being done to this particular issue and the arguments around it. But it appears to be an epidemic of issues and the conflicts that arise around the questions and complications and implications. Reach a certain point. It all builds to a certain point where it kind of clicks into a modality of function. And by that I mean, independent of what the idea or the concept or the issue or the theme or the divide or the whatever the thing is, it eventually becomes a wedge issue treadmill of argumentation dynamic. Homelessness. I don't know why that one just popped up, but it's like, we're not solving it, right? We're arguing about it, and at a legislative level, if you're looking at it, we're fighting battles over legislation that's not solving the problem. Even if it were really good legislation, it's still sort of attacking it in directions that don't address the causes of the problem, because the problem is not homeless people on the street. The problem is that the entire system of systems that we call our economies, at local levels, at state levels, and at federal levels, function in such a way that people get pushed out of housing, and there's no recourse. There's no option for them. And I know that instinctively some people will be like, but the nanny state is bad. And I'm like, yeah, but are we not, as a collective, supposed to be working towards supporting and helping and facilitating others, all of us, together, as a community? Just as a sidebar comparison, like, we're not, our issues, whether it's homelessness, whether it's abortion, whether it's immigration, whether it's this or that, there's a litany, right? Like, I should reference my meme, the us versus them meme, which I don't have handy. I should have pulled it up. But legitimate issues, legitimate problems that require legitimate solutions spiral out of control, devolve into a scenario, a dynamic between groups of people and the politicians that propagate the ideology that those groups of people adhere to, and engage in this dynamic of, we must fight the opposition to this thing, and we must fight the proposition of, we must oppose each other, essentially. My party must oppose that party, and their party must oppose my party, and the politicians and the legislation and the ways in which we legislate will all be symptoms of that fight, as opposed to solutions that we collaboratively and consensually arrive at, that are meaningful, effective, fair, balanced, and impactful. Like, that they act like we could be solving the problem, friends. That's the part that, all of it is a big tragedy, right? Like, the entire, it's not one thing, is it? Abortion. It's one word, and it's easy to just be like, I'm against that one word. I'm in favor of that one word. I support the word, I oppose the word. But it's a complex set of different things, all in confluence. And what pains me the most, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, is that as a society, as a people, as a community of communities, we could be having thoughtful, intellectually honest, mindful, grounded, centered, productive public discourse and civic action that develops real solutions that don't require the stripping away of anyone's rights, and that actually get to the root causes in a tangible, meaningful way. And, I'm not the only one pointing this out. Instead of overturning Roe versus Wade and letting half of American states implement think tank developed boilerplated bans with little to no exceptions in some cases. In some states, there's no exemption bans, right? I mean, the implications of that over the long haul are horrific if you just stop to really think about it and listen to the real life lived experiences of women who've encountered the problematic issues involved in, complicated, complications to the pregnancy, health diagnoses of the child that are, unviable, and situations that threaten the life of the mother. Those are real, those are valid, those are tangible, those are not theoretical things. They're actual risks that are present in every pregnancy, right? Instead of banning this one option, we could be providing top shelf, world class, like engineering healthcare. We could be providing top tier, world class sexual health education, age appropriate places, right? We could be providing, as I pointed out in the last episode, better, healthier, less toxic, and less misogynistic in its deployment, like in terms of we could be providing better birth control options to both parties, to both genders, including like the clips. I still don't know what that procedure or what the system was called, but it was real, right? I used to have some page about it bookmarked somewhere, but that was many computers ago, and although it may still have migrated through and be buried deep in some folder somewhere, I wouldn't know off the top of my head what keywords to use to find it. But I digress. We could be finding solutions that address the actual problems instead of stripping away rights and creating a macabre and frankly quite dark ages, level of seriously backwards and messed up forced pregnancies and perpetuate, this terrible lack of other healthcare provisions to mothers, pregnancy being something that's tangibly, literally, undeniably riddled with risk for their health and their personal, their life, even in the best conditions. Instead of actually finding compassionate, meaningful, tangible solutions to all the different complicated issues at the center of the set of things that we represent with the abortion issue, instead of providing the healthcare required to mitigate the risk, instead of providing the education necessary in order to minimize the risk of unwanted pregnancies, instead of providing fair, balanced, and gender equal birth control and prophylactics to further minimize the risk of undesired or unplanned or unwanted or unexpected pregnancies, we're literally left to continue fighting an echo chamber that keeps us ever so distracted enough and outraged enough that we are not able as a society to really hear one another and really do the work required to find those reasonable, sensible, fair, balanced, meaningful, compassionate solutions. And why? One must ask, why is why can it seriously feel like, instead of solving problems, we're cornered into a pit fight? And there seems to be an effort to increasingly normalize that as the way to solve problems, which of course is a slippery slope into actual public violence, which I have zero support for. I cannot abide by any political ideology, any religious ideology, any social ideology that is incrementally nudging individuals and groups towards unnecessary and unwarranted acts of violence towards anyone else in the name of the ideology. I hope I'm wrong. I'm really kind of astonished at myself. I didn't, I really do sort of step back and go, I'm amazed that, no wonder I can't get a job at a gas station. I literally do voice my concerns in an attempt to bring about or plant seeds to inspire or to gently provoke the public discourse towards a different focal point, right? Not that I'm trying to steer the conversation away from the very issue. It's a huge issue. And the second to last thing I was talking about in yesterday's episode, for anyone who didn't catch the end of it, organize, organize, organize. Right? I stand with women. I stand for supporting the right of all women to choose either direction. That's what autonomy is. A woman has the right to choose to end a pregnancy or keep it under scientifically sound parameters, right? Especially given known dangers and health risks and the whole issue, the whole complex set of issues is not something that we can stand by and have stripped away and legislated into an oppressive state by a movement. And here's why I'm like, let's zoom out, right? The heat and the passion of all that reside at the center of the issue, I'm not trying to abandon or steer away from or distract from. I'm trying to say, let's acknowledge, and this is my biggest concern, why I say, we need to zoom back and make sure we do not avoid discussing the elephant in the room. Who is pushing this agenda? And why? The GOP and its base is literally out there mansplaining to women that they need to give up their right to privacy, autonomy, self-determination, give up their right to appropriate medical health care, give up their right to be able to make this decision in the once considered, law of the land, private sanctum of consulting with her doctor. Right? If we're going to respect legal privileges, like the privilege between a lawyer and their client, or in other scenarios, right, the privacy between a therapist and their client, or a priest in a confession box and their client in the confession box. It's outrageous that we would violate the privacy and, sanctum of consultation between a woman and her primary healthcare provider, or any healthcare provider, right? But zooming back further back, I keep getting caught up myself in sort of like parts of the layers of the complexity because I don't want to appear to be like just ignoring them or not acknowledging them or not taking them into account. I'm just trying to add something to this that we should not. If the pattern and the indications are correct, then we really can't afford to ignore this part of the problem's problem. And that's that somewhere, in the dark recesses of the corners of power, the headquarters of power where these things are driven, it appears to me, and I don't think I'm alone, that this agenda is the vanguard, the first wave of a series of attacks on, constitutionally established modern rights under, using the pretextual excuse of it's not a keyword in the document and it didn't exist before blah 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 date and such retroactive arguments. But the thing I'm concerned with, the driving element ideologically at the core of all of those efforts seems to be, and I say this like as a theory that I think we need to discuss, investigate, and find out, if it's accurate or not, and then decide what to do about it and do something about it. Because to keep referencing The Big Lebowski, that kind of aggression cannot stand, man. But this movement, this vanguard event, not the leaking, obviously, although who knows, maybe people on the same side leaked it just to fan the flames and get the conflict started, right? But this movement and the predictable series of other potential attacks that this movement seems to be positioning itself to launch, it pretends to be a lot of things. It pretends to be fighting for the little guy. It pretends to be fighting against corruption in the government. It pretends to be a lot of things. But one of the things it doesn't pretend, because I think it's very real and doesn't even try to hide so much increasingly, is that it seems to be driven by a desire at its core to push America increasingly in the direction of transforming, becoming, reestablishing itself as some kind of theocracy, some kind of white Christian nationalist pseudo-democracy with a religiously established law of the land, and that's just a spirally slippery slope of Dark Ages 2.0. And I guess perhaps for a lot of people this is like patently obvious, and if it is, I apologize. But I'm really sort of speaking to the Venn diagram of individuals who are disaffected and have been distant from politics and don't even, aren't really sure what's going on and are just sort of like tuning into this and maybe just sort of being further disgusted by politics and sort of thinking, well, none of this affects me because I can't have babies, I won't have babies, I'm not a woman, etc., 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 or I'm a woman but I'm not going to have babies anymore, or I would have an abortion anyways, or whatever those are. But there's plenty of disaffected people on both, men and women, etc., plenty of disaffected eligible voters that aren't voting, plenty of disaffected people that have been voting but, have been edging increasingly towards not caring enough to continue to do so. There's a whole series, there's a Venn diagram, there's a whole coalition of people that could, should, would realize they have skin in this game, that they have, that there are things at stake that will impact them, because the impact doesn't just stop at preventing the way it's characterized, the way it's depicted, the way it's explained by the right. That that isn't the full scope of potential damaging impact that living in a world where this decision is overturned and states, and we have this culture war on a state by state level. The ramifications are huge. Not the least of which is if the theory is correct and there's then an escalating series of expected, actions coming from this same momentum behind getting the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, then we're looking like we're really truly facing some kind of American Christian patriarchy that wants to replace the founding fathers' idea of a melting pot, of not that the founding fathers were perfect by all means. There's plenty of flaws and imperfections, but given the context by which we can analyze and consider the founding documents and the founding fathers, and the perspective that this idea of ever increasing towards a more perfect union where, quote, all men and arguably all women are created equal, I really don't see a white Christian patriarchal oligarchy or kleptocracy, because that's what it would really be, in my humble opinion. My concern is that if there is a movement of people trying to establish some sort of Christian moral majority or some kind of Christian moral authority in government, like to strip away the separation of church and state as a small d democratic norm, as a norm of the democratic republic that we are, the place that we could end up at as a nation in an alarmingly quick pace too is unacceptable. It's completely, categorically, morally, ethically, intellectually, patriotically unacceptable to myself and, I'm sure, millions of others. We're supposed to have, freedom of religion doesn't mean freedom of this particular splinter of a very dark and twisted perversion of Christianity to do whatever it damn well pleases and oppress and eliminate and or push out all other religions or all other people. Now, that's a big, huge leap, right? Like, are we going to a totalitarian state where we can only be blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and believe in Rambo Jesus? I mean, it's not that impossible to consider as a possibility, right? They already have the Rambo Jesus flags and posters and desktop, what do you call them? Desktop images. They're already, what? It's on the t-shirts. They got t-shirts and it's a meme. Like, there already literally is a growing Christian sect that glorifies and sanctifies and worships with and seems to idolize a weapon that can only be described as a machine for butchering people. Right? They go to church and perform ceremonies strapped with their semi-automatic, fully automatic machines of war. Now, are they the Christian majority in this country? Of course not. is that particular church, whose name I don't remember. I've seen a couple of different articles and documentaries that reference them. Are they the ones pushing this? Probably not. But there seems to be a loose coalition of various Christian activists that are closely tied to the white nationalist movement. And of course, the white nationalist movement, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't most neo-Nazis, white nationalists, Nazis, etc., white supremacists of whatever sub-variety, generally, most of the time, say a strong 89 to like 98% self-identified Christians? Like, they belong to some weird, messed up version of white supremacy Christianity. Like, there is, this is undeniable. And one of my concerns is that it's seemed pretty clear from a zoomed back, far enough, detached enough perspective, not caught up in the immediate tug of war of right versus left and left versus right, that this has been a growing issue that has been sort of spreading like a cancer across the American political landscape in ways that, despite its rearing its ugly head in some obvious ways, I think a few too many Americans aren't really quite like self-aware about just yet. And forgive me if I sound outrageous, but the entire notion, from my perspective, is categorically un-American, and intellectually and ethically, morally invalid. The human species is genetically 99.99999% identical across all places of origin and creeds and, ethnic identities. And the deep problems that come about with unexpected, unplanned, unprepared for pregnancies, and these are two different buckets, right? And the complications of problematic pregnancy issues that are dangerous to the health of the child and the mother can be solved with compassionate solutions based on rational thought, science, and, basic human decency. Instead, we're living through this. And it is an extension of something I spoke about when I addressed the end of the Trumptopian chapter in a Good Morning Trumptopia episode not too long ago, not long after Trump actually managed to exit the White House successfully without more chaos than what he caused, right? And I'm not trying to minimize that. I'm just saying it could have gone so much worse. It could have gone so much worse. But what I'm trying to get at is that, he's gone. He's out of office. Despite all the shenanigans that he will continue to try to pull off, there is a sort of potential timeline that would have branched off if he had remained in office. That is, we are now securely marked safe from, in the meme of I mark myself safe from this today. And thank God that whole branch of probability waveform functions that could have spiraled out of control had he remained in office, we won't have to live through. It will not exist. But as I warned back then, the Trumptopian mentality, the mindset, the seductive, crazy cacophony of rabbit holes of, the whole rabbit warren of rabbit holes that is Trumptopian, Q-topian and some other subvariants of crazy thinking, the mindset, this sort of multiplex of conspiracy theory meets religiosity meets a crazy sort of fake as F Christianity that is toxic, and that Jesus would be like, what on earth are you people doing if he showed up right now, kind of level, is not magically over with, right? As we've seen, I think that, my concern there panned out in exactly the way that I was concerned it would, and here we are. Not that I predicted anything, I'm just saying this seems to be a clear trajectory that this movement will try to thrive on, even if Trump manages to undermine his own success and his own legacy as hard as I always imagined that he would. Because the only person undermining Donald Trump throughout the entire spectacular dumpster fire that was the Trump administration was Donald Trump. The only person undermining Donald Trump in politics was Donald Trump. And you know why I can say that confidently? Because I'm of the very jaded and I guess jaded is strong enough. I'm of the jaded opinion that like very few people get into that level of office without being pre-screened and approached by whatever forces that are pushing and shoving and manipulating from various quadrants and directions. And the corruption encroaches you and tries to wrap any individual in its tentacles long before any American votes on any nominee. And given Trump's background as a lifelong Democrat who donated endlessly to the Democratic Party and to the Republican Party, and as a lifelong opportunist, which cannot be denied, and as a lifelong shady character that likes to play and game the system to his wherever he sees opportunistic profit potential to line his own pockets. So, reeling back, sorry, spiraling way out, not trying to pin anything on Trump right now. I'm just saying that the confluence of all of it, like I said yesterday, from the roots of this in the back in the days of Barry Goldwater and the establishment of this sort of evangelical Christian politically active being a Christian evangelical activist was something that at a certain point in American history was frowned upon and looked like, no. We respect the separation of church and state here in this country from both sides of the left versus right spectrum. And, it's out the window. They made a golden statue of Trump, and the imagery and the echoes there are just too ridiculous. People, not all Republicans, obviously, I'm not trying to paint the entire GOP in one monolithic tone. I realize it's a whole cacophony of different variants on some sort of politicized Christianity. But as I meant to point out yesterday, but then failed to read the quote. Excuse me 1 second. A frog in the throat there for a second. Jimmy Carter himself, and please forgive me if this is a completely fake quote, but I swear I think I've heard it. Jimmy Carter is quoted as saying, Christianity has been hijacked by a group of people that would give Christ himself the boot if he came to the door. Okay? I myself, independent of anything Jimmy Carter has ever said about politicized Christianity, I have been asking and begging the question since I sat in CCD class in a Catholic church at the age of 7 or 8. ever since I learned, whenever you freaking learn about the separation of church and state in civics, my questions were doubled and doubled down in both directions. If we have a just separation of church and state, why do we have a party that seems to be trying to actively craft a sort of Christian version of Sharia law in this country and, bit by bit, chunk by chunk, right by right, issue by issue, transform this nation into a white Christian nationalist autocracy / kleptocracy? Why does the GOP get away with endlessly milking its base for donations, using that money irresponsibly? Why does it? Since when was it cool for a political party to pay for any criminally investigated politicians' private legal fees? Is that what's supposed to happen? That's to me. I could be wrong, but that to me kind of really reeks of corruption, of like potential corruption, of an avenue, a portal, an opening for corruption. But where can we go? Where can we go from here, friends? We need to remember to balance our perspectives, to keep an eye on the broadest view and go, okay, what is motivating this? Where is this coming from? And there's a mountain of questions there. There's just an endless series of questions. But we need to ask them and have them answered publicly, truthfully, honestly, in a way that doesn't attempt to mislead through intellectual shenanigans where you get some partial truth, etc. You know what I mean? And we need to root out the origin of this effort so that we can end we can identify, call it out, and be like, hey, look at this. Look, let's connect these dots here. And go, well, how's about we, as a society, collectively, stop fighting these engineered wedge issue fights and start solving the actual problems. Start healing the actual people who need to be healed. Start saving the lives, make it so that no woman has to face a pregnancy that they didn't want. Make it so that no woman has to go through a pregnancy by force, by legal dictate. And make it so that no woman has to suffer the medical risks and obstacles and threats that are, inherent in this tricky and complicated and very intimate process, because it isn't a yes or no, objectively black or white scenario. There's layers and layers and layers of complexity to it, and until all of society listens to women about the pain and the struggle and the needs involved and the risks involved, until all of society, all of male society, really deeply listens and understands and empathizes and relates to, and until all of society really abdicates these ideological treadmills and really starts addressing everything from a compassionate solutions-based approach. We're just going to keep bashing each other's faces into brick walls, man. And that kind of self-abuse cannot stand. And that kind of political shenanigans cannot be abided by. The right has exposed its most egregious levels of like deep hypocrisy, right? That it's literally leveraging multiple components of the federal government to hijack the judiciary in order to then leverage and manipulate the state government to strip away a constitutionally established right and enforce a medieval condition of living on all women, or as many women as they can get away with, without, provide and stripping away, providing less and less medical care that is intrinsically important and often urgently needed during the course of a pregnancy. It's just mind-boggling and egregiously immoral and inhumane and un-American on all levels, especially if the long-term end result is some kind of ethno-religious state that dictates out of the Bible. And there's a reason why we don't make laws out of the Bible. There's some beautiful things in the Bible, my friend. Let it not be. Let's not ignore that. Let it not be, denied. There are some beautiful, meaningful, spiritually profound things in the Bible. I'm the first to say it. Just said it right now, right? Well, I didn't say it first in the show, but we only just here got to this thing. I'll admit that. I'll not just admit it. I'll not just admit it. I will applaud it. But there's also absolute nonsense, pure political garbage, and obvious us versus them tribalistic neurolinguistic conditioning for the purposes of inciting war and other atrocities. And, impossible things that can't be, proven true. It cannot be the basis of a civil society's code of law without also being quickly corrupted and turned into a violation of human rights. There's a reason why governments must remain secular and there must be a separation of church and state. It's as obvious and as on the nose as the Dark Ages. Everything that happened in the medieval times. The fact that Rome and the Catholic Church was once an empire that puppeteered the kings and queens and leaders of countries. We can't have an American, Rambo Jesus version of that. And that's what I gotta say about that, friends. As crazy and as bizarre and as intense as it is to have to bring the whole conversation to that level, I can't see any rational reason why a fair, balanced, legally sound Supreme Court would ever overturn something that was established through a legally sound and balanced constitutional process in the Supreme Court, right? Never in the history of the United States has the Supreme Court established something and then turned around, a generation and a half, 2 generations later and struck it down. It's a dangerous first precedent. And I can see people making arguments for it. The leaked document itself tries pretty hard to sound fair and balanced, especially at the beginning. But it's the collective preponderance of evidence trailing back, 60 years towards a growingly eccentric and extremist impulse towards some kind of Christianification, some sort of, imposition of Christianity onto the state that's behind all this. So the coalition of the willing to defend against that must unite in a meaningful, effective, efficient way that doesn't get bogged down by the many sub-issues or variants or schisms or fault lines by which they might get, tripped up and caught up in some divisiveness, if I may be so bold as to suggest. And we need to speak out together. Men who consider themselves allies, any man that realizes that there are women in his life that have suffered this kind of pain and have had to make this difficult choice one way or the other, have to understand that they cannot gleefully support the elimination of this choice, and that they must take the time to stop and listen to the women in their lives that would, and there'll be a mix of them, right? Because there's plenty of women that support this. But you can't just listen to the one side on the issue. And that's always true about any given issue, right? Like, to make a well-considered decision, one that really, truly makes a serious effort at actually solving problems as opposed to just perpetuating divisive rhetoric, one must listen to all sides of the issue and sort of analyze that input and identify problematic issues that need to be sort of identified and dealt with, and then find the convergences for useful, meaningful, compassionate, thoughtful, effective solutions to the actual problem. I feel like I'm getting a bit redundant, and so, friends, I humbly thank you for tuning in to this second burst of discussion. I think I had a different set of thoughts that I wanted to address yesterday as I was winding down yesterday's episode, and today I was just stuck at this meta-level concern. Like, all the concerns in the nugget of the issue, of course, are important and valid and need to be discussed and addressed, and all sides heard out and then, solved or sorted through. And I know that under some contexts, under some perspectives, it seems like the opposition is intractable and cannot be compromised with. But I assure you, friends, if we approach these kinds of problems from a more holistic perspective, if we approach from a perspective of wanting to heal and transcend the issue, not litigate, punish, and ban the opposition to the issue or of the issue, the opposition side party on the issue, you know what I mean? Our civic society and our legislative mechanisms cannot become a tit-for-tat game of tag, you're oppressed, and tag, you're liberated. I will call that the button of the show and put a plug in my mug and stop rambling. Friends, as always, I invite your input, feedback, questions, comments, response. If you'd like to do it right there on the very originating platform for this podcast, the destination you want to get to is, I had it up and I clicked away from it, Spreaker.com. That's spelled SPREAKER.com/show/ZenCast. If that's too much to remember or write down, head on over to solo.to/Mr. Zeppo, where you can find all the different links and all the different platforms where you can find this podcast, just in case you'd rather catch it on a podcast catcher instead of navigate to the Spreaker Origin website. It's all there for you. For those who are curious, this podcast is created and available through Spreaker.com, and as well as the following apps: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast, CastBox, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, GeoSavan, and many more. As always, friends, thank you for indulging in the roller coaster ride of hearing me out on my neurodivergent and sometimes wildly, spiralingly fractal a series of thoughts. And thank you for your support. And we'll see you next time. I guess we'll hear you next time. May peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart, and may you find your center, feel grounded, and then reach out to those around you and organize. Organize, organize, organize. And, I want to end on this note, actually, now that we're talking about organization. The right is preemptively judging, casting aspersions, and predicting that the left will get obscenely violent. And, some people on the left are indeed calling for riots. Some people are using quite provocative language and imagery. And as much as I stand in favor of reestablishing a pro-choice legal framework, I invoke the call for pacifist protest, peaceful, effective, heart-based, spirit-based protest, mindfulness-oriented protest. Friends, if that's some new language for you, I humbly invite you to consider it, contemplate it, and have discussions about it with your activist buddies. I find myself inclined to believe, and you know how rarely I care to use that phrase, but it's the best way to describe it. I find myself inclined to believe that a massive, undeniable turnout that acts cohesively in a deeply mindful, deeply pacifist, deeply spiritual, non-denominational, organized religion, just sort of in the spirit of compassion, to speak up and out against this encroachment of imposed religious authoritarian oppression, more change can be achieved than if we allow ourselves and each other to spiral out of control and turn towards reckless violence. And I know that there will be outbursts of it anyways, because there's always the provocateurs and the opportunists and the sinister, sort of cynical individuals out there that will take any opportunity and any advantage to create a little chaos and try to, paint a group of protesters as reckless rioters that want to see the world burn. And we can't deny the fact that there are just some people that do. Right, but we must strive to commune with each other in our heart of hearts, as well as through our words and our protest actions. Let us not forget, let us not neglect the energetic and the intentional in this moment. Let us not forget to sit in meditation and contemplation and in spiritual communion with one another, to share in through and with and in the spiritual network that arguably some of us suggest exists, as much as we do in the town square and in the public spaces of discourse and protest. The two go hand in hand, my friends. Okay. Enough rambling on my part. That's today's show. Thank you for tuning in. Please drop by the solo.to/Mr. Zeppo and explore the other dimensions of the Zeppoverse, and I will see you elsewhere. And I'll see you here again soon.
And that is the latest breaking news. We now return you to your regularly scheduled brainwashing. Thank you for listening,